The committee will come to order. Welcome to today's filled hearing of the Ways and Means Committee about the future of America's trade policy. I am told that this filled hearing is the first outside full committee hearing in 100 years in Congress. And to do that in Staten Island, we are blessed to be here with Ms. Nicole Malliotakis in her beautiful district. As America's front door to the world, New York City and ports like the one here at Staten Island represent the front lines of America's global trade. Last year, the total value of U.S. goods traded was approximately $5.3 trillion. That includes food from our farmers, the energy in our homes, the medical equipment in our hospitals, and everything in between. There isn't a single worker, family, or business in our country that isn't impacted by trade, some positively and some negatively. Unfortunately, bad trade policies in Washington have allowed foreign countries to take advantage of our workers and destroy American jobs. Last year, our trade deficit reached $945 billion, the largest ever. The American worker should be at the center of our trade policy. That's why the Ways and Means Committee is here today, to listen to Americans on the front lines about how we can revitalize fair trade in America. During the hearing, we will be passing around notebooks that you'll see right over here. I'd like to ask all of our audience members to please share your thoughts about how Congress can improve U.S. trade policies. We want to hear from you, and we want that submitted into the record. One key step is to secure our supply chains. We must reduce our dependency on nations who do not share our values or have aligned interests. To be clear, a country that cannot supply their own demand for food, energy, and medicine, but instead rely on other nations to fulfill those basic needs, they are no longer independent, but they are politically dependent. That means producing more of our own medicine and energy, and where we can't make it here, ensuring that we are sourcing from allies close to home. For our food supply, it means making sure our farmers are viable and able to make a living off the land and sell American-grown products without facing non-tariff barriers around the world. We need to aggressively enforce the commitments our trading partners made to treat U.S. products fairly. We must build on the progress from USMCA by pushing more trading partners to open their markets so our farmers and small businesses can compete and win. American families, they need results. We must use trade enforcement tools to chart a new path forward to put American workers first and to hold accountable bad actors, including China. To do that, Congress must reassert its constitutional role as the lead in U.S. trade policy. Right now, the administration is trying to work around Congress and create so-called frameworks that lack the force of law. Congress needs to shine a light on China's human rights abuses and predatory trade practices. China is forging ahead with an aggressive trade agenda that cheats America, shapes the global playing field in its favor, and threatens key American supply chains and the livelihoods of American farmers and American workers. What should be now clear to everyone here today is that our country needs is a smart and strategic decoupling from China. Workers and small businesses being harmed by China's unfair trade practices have been overlooked and forgotten for way too long. They expect us to go further and to use the tools at our disposal to level the playing field for workers, farmers, and job creators. We're here to make sure the future of U.S. trade includes their voices. I'd like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. Del Heminger is a second-generation owner and operator of Hemdell Farms, Dairy, and Greenhouses in Ontario County. John Atkins, our host today, is the president of Global Containers Terminal USA. Nuri Turkel is the first U.S.-educated Uyghur American lawyer and human rights advocate. who serves as the chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and John Romano, CEO of Tronix, and Thomas O'Shea, President of the United Steelworkers, Local 135. I want to thank our witnesses for taking time away from their families and their busy schedules to share your stories and ideas, and I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Ranking Member Mr. Nill, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for joining with our witnesses today and holding this hearing. President Biden and congressional Democrats continue to push an economic and trade agenda that is focused not only on building the economy, but that benefits all members of the working families in America and across our great country. Democrats have charted the course for worker-centric trade policy for well over a decade. I want to thank those of you who were responsible for putting up the banners here today. We are indeed very grateful for the reminder that we want all to prosper because of American trade agreements. House Democrats, with leadership of this committee, paved the way for the May 10th agreement, which brought labor and environmental provisions to the core of the U.S. trade agreements and made them enforceable for the first time. Democrats have continued to build on the successes of the May 10th agreement. Most recently, Ways and Means Democrats demanded that prior administration renegotiate, and we did with the USMCA to enforce these trade agreements. We ultimately led to a successful agreement that updated NAFTA, the most pro-worker trade agreement ever based on the renegotiation, with new facility-specific labor enforcement mechanisms to address violations of worker rights in Mexico. The Biden administration has used this new mechanism 8 times to address labor issues that are in front of us. I know something about that agreement. I was the lead negotiator on it. And I want to say that in the end, 195 Democrats voted for that trade agreement, 194 Republicans voted for it. Jimmy Hoffa endorsed it, Rich Trumka endorsed it, and the Republican representative, Bob Lighthizer, did a great job on that trade agreement because he agreed with us on the enforcement of these agreements. We understand that U.S. trade policies should not come at the expense of American jobs or the rights of workers at home and abroad. That's why committee Democrats have championed the Uyghur Enforcement Act to prohibit the import of products made with forced labor by the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, China. We believe that no supply chain should contain products made with forced labor. We know trade, when coupled with the right domestic economic policies, can play an important role in creating new jobs and supporting a thriving economy. The U.S. should open its market to fair trade. When countries can, we all benefit. For this reason, committee Democrats have led the charge to reauthorize and reform the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act for Workers, commonly known as TAA, because we don't think that we should leave American workers behind as a result of increased trade with other countries. We need to convince our colleagues on the other side that TAA is really important. Committee Democrats are committed to delivering for the American worker by creating necessary policies that will be of benefit to them. In this vein, House Democrats included TAA in the American Competes Act, the most expansive pro-worker legislation to combat China's unfair trade practices in years. This legislation, which we passed last year, would strengthen U.S. trade laws and invest in America's workers while boosting Americans' economic opportunities. Our colleagues on the other side, they need to help us pursue these policies so that we don't do things to the detriment of American workers. Let me be clear. The other side has proposed to slash the budgets of federal agencies that administer and enforce these trade laws, in some cases by up to 22%. These budget cuts to U.S. Customs and Border Protection will not be helpful to the Department of Commerce and other agencies that promote small businesses. We want to make sure that these cuts don't take place. I urge all the members of this committee to ensure that American workers, farmers, and businesses have the tools they need to compete in a global economy. President Biden and congressional Democrats have delivered for the American people. Delighted this morning when Mr. Atkins mentioned the CHIPS issue. It is happening because of the legislation that we helped to pass. As a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law, $9.3 billion is going to go directly to New York to invest in roads, bridges, transit, ports and airports, and other opportunities for clean water across this region. These historic investments will reach communities across the entire country, including rural America and underserved populations. Federal investments in tax credits championed by Democrats on this committee in the Inflation Reduction Act will also drive New York's clean energy transition and create jobs, take us on a path to net zero emissions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for offering us this opportunity and allowing our witnesses to share their expertise and experience with us.
Thank you, Mr. Nill. I'm pleased to recognize the gentle lady from New York, Ms. Maliotakis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, members of the committee, and welcome to Staten Island. We are the site of the 1776 Peace Conference during the Revolutionary War. Fort Wadsworth was used by the British as their private defense location. It is where tennis was first introduced in the United States in 1874, and Sandy Ground is the nation's oldest free settlement for African Americans. You may have seen Staten Island on the big screen if you watched Easy Money, Working Girl, Godfather, Saturday Night Fever. We are birthplace to Pete Davidson and the Impractical Jokers. And we, of course, are home to the iconic Staten Island Ferry, and what I would argue is the best cannoli in the United States of America, which we will have for you to try later this morning. I would like to thank the chairman for choosing Staten Island as the setting for the first field hearing on trade in America. It is my hope that this experience gives members of the committee a new perspective on New York City and reveals the vital role that our ports fulfill when looking at American trade policy and practice. We are standing in one of the largest harbors in the world. From 1892 to 1924, over 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island to become American citizens and strengthen this great nation. New York City is and always will be a hub for American trade, going back to 1613 when the Dutch established fur trading posts in both Manhattan and Staten Island, and trade will always be a cornerstone of our nation's economy. Today, these historic waters make up the largest container port on the East Coast and the second largest in the country. In the first 3 months of 2023, the Port of New York and New Jersey was the nation's second busiest port, moving nearly 1.8 million containers, and last year it moved $271 billion worth of goods. Our community is excited that this container terminal is planning to increase its capacity by 65% through 2027 and double by 2030. And it's because of both private investment and federal funding for infrastructure and dredging by the Army Corps of Engineers that larger vessels and more service options for goods coming and going will be possible in the future. And I will work with everyone here to make sure our waters are ready for larger vessels and the positive impact that they will bring. But in order for the local and national economy to truly reap the benefits of these investments, we must have a pro-growth tax and trade agenda, and that is exactly what our House Republicans are focused on. While this terminal highlights positive recovery and avoidance of pandemic-era headaches, consumer patterns have undoubtedly changed and global supply chains continue to shift. Though the Port of New York and New Jersey has received a slight increase in container processing, future freight orders seem to point to a freight slowdown in conjunction with an economic contraction and stalling economy under President Biden. One area where we feel that we can lead as a Ways and Means Committee, and there's great potential to grow our GDP, is exports. The U.S. became energy independent and a net exporter for the first time in modern history under the Trump administration, and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement passed with bipartisan support has increased our region's competitiveness in the global economy. Now, our committee is working to reduce our dependency on China by enacting pro-growth and trade policies, strengthening trade relationships with those who share our values to bring critical supply chains for energy, pharmaceuticals, and technology home where we can, and work with our allies, not our adversaries, where we can't. To protect our economy and our national security, Americans cannot be at the mercy of a nation that can weaponize these life-sustaining resources against us, as we have seen Russia do to Europe with energy. It is time to work to eliminate trade barriers, restore fair trade agreements with our closest allies, provide new markets for American products, create jobs for American workers, and fill this container terminal. I look forward to hearing today's testimony and working with my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to accomplish these goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Maliotakis. Would like to introduce our witnesses. Mr. John Atkins, our host today, is the president of Global Containers Terminal USA. We have Mr. Del Heminger, is a second-generation owner and operator of Hemdell Farms, Dairy and Greenhouses in Ontario County. We have Mr. Nuri Turkel. He's the first U.S.-educated Uyghur American lawyer and human rights advocate who serves as the chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. We have Mr. John Romano, who's the co-CEO of Tronix. And then Mr. Thomas Oshai is the president of United Steelworkers Local 135. The committee has received your written statements, and they will all be made part of the formal hearing record. I also want to let others in attendance know that they too may provide a written statement. Please find the clipboards that we will be passing out throughout the hearing available, and your statements will be added to the record when submitted. Now for our guest, you each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Mr. Atkins, you may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and I want to thank the committee for coming to GCT New York for its meeting. We're all here today because trade is all our livelihood. My name's John Atkins. I've worked in the marine cargo handling industry, which is reliant on the trading relationships of the United States, for 38 years. President GCT USA, which operates 2 Green Marine certified terminals, both here in Bayonne and also at our site here in New York. I'm also chairman of the Sustainable Terminal Services. It's a nonprofit corporation composed of the 6 container terminal operators in the Port of New York and New Jersey, whose primary purpose is to promote environmentally sensitive, efficient, and secure marine terminal operations in the port. While we're all competitors, we put the competitive spirit aside to focus on collective projects that have been implemented for the betterment of the port as a whole. These projects focus on the environmental issues, both physical and cyber security, and supply chain fluidity through information sharing. The container terminal operators can only work together to pursue these port-wide goals through the authorities granted through a discussion agreement filed with and approved by the Federal Maritime Commission. This discussion agreement provides limited antitrust immunity for discussions of this nature among the marine terminal operators. This arrangement is under attack, and we urge your support to preserve this tool that allows marine terminal operators to act together for the collective good. The businesses and labor serving this port have always stepped up in performing their functions that are vital to the regional and national economy, as well as the well-being of all Americans. I'm particularly proud of the performance of management and longshore workers during the challenges of COVID-19 pandemic. In uncertain times, they came to work every day and kept the cargo flowing. This was not easy, but in cooperation with the ILA, the marine terminal operators in the port were able to implement reasonable work rules and sanitizing procedures that permitted work to go on in a responsible manner. These workers are the unsung heroes of the pandemic. Because of these workers, the nation was able to obtain PPE and supplies needed to permit people to go to stores and other places of business to get the economy moving. Collectively, the marine terminal operators in Port of New York and New Jersey have invested billions of dollars in facility improvements and equipment to efficiently handle current and enhanced cargo volumes. In 2022, in the port, we efficiently handled cargo volumes 9.5 million TEUs that had not been anticipated to occur until 2030. However, the story of our significant investment and dedication to the work are not what you read about in the news. In general, media coverage has done our industry a great disservice, and our industry fears that this misrepresentation may be fueling hasty governmental regulation, while considered with good intentions, may have unforeseen and harmful consequences. The media reporting on the 2022 supply chain crisis often use venues like you see here today as visuals in their news accounts. This reporting has been harmful to the industry because it gave legislators and the public the mistaken impression that the crisis was caused by ocean carriers transporting goods and marine terminal operators like the one here today that offload the cargo from these vessels and transfer it to truck and rail to its final destination. This mistaken impression also brought forth the ire of the White House, which resulted in hastily enacted legislation that will not prevent but may encourage the next supply chain crisis. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act, or as we term OSRA, and the ensuring regulations of the FMC has sought to lay the blame for supply chain challenges on ocean carriers and MTOs. This regulatory activity places undue burdens on carriers and MTOs for the failure of shippers and other cargo interests to receive their cargo in a timely manner. It is undisputed fact that domestic marine terminals have limited space. The efficient operations of a marine terminal are based on principles of velocity and fluidity. Impediments to fluidity are long container dwell times. During the 2022 supply chain crisis, cargo interests allowed their containers to languish at our facilities, causing log jams in the system. Our marine terminals were used as long-term storage alternatives to off-terminal container depots and warehouse facilities. Now the regulators are placing the burden on MTOs to bear the costs for such long-dwell containers. That is against the incentive principle that the FMC is supposed to espouse in ensuring that cargo moves efficiently through marine terminals. The longer a container dwell in the terminal, the longer it takes to service the trucks to drop them off and pick them up. However, pending FMC regulations do not enumerate procedures for the FMC to assess whether the cargo interest was in fact verifiably ready and able with a truck driver, a chassis, and a destination to bring the container before a container can be retrieved. Instead, they place the sole burden on ocean carriers and marine terminal operators for the inefficiencies in the inland components of the supply chain. Another issue of critical importance to the Port of New York and New Jersey is dredging, which includes having a reliable source of funding for critical dredging projects. The Port is dependent on a consistent program of maintenance and deepening dredging projects. The Port of New York and New Jersey, in dredging parlance, is referred to as a donor port to the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. That means the fees generated by cargo operations here significantly outweigh the monies that are allocated to the port here in New York for vital dredging projects. As this port has done since the beginning of our nation, as Nicole has pointed out, it continues to be one of the largest contributors to this nation's ability to maintain the waterways for the common good. The Port of New York and New Jersey is having issues with obtaining the funds that were supposed to be authorized for its piles and fender dredging project under WIRDA 2020. The port should have been slated to get $56 million for this maintenance dredging, with escalations up to $70 million. However, the port was only authorized for $6.1 million for this purpose because of differences between what was negotiated and what was appropriated under WIRDA. We need your help. If not corrected, the port will take a $350 million hit on dredging funds that should be authorized for this port. We understand that the problem is expanding the use for Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund to secondary sources like locks and levees and beach refurbishment. However, this is against the principle that harbor maintenance fees generated in port should inure to the benefit of those ports. Please help the port maintain its position as an economic engine for this region and the nation and release money being held in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. As stated, the domestic marine cargo handling industry is dependent on this country's trade with other nations. We understand that this is a complex issue with certain nations acting in a belligerent manner towards the United States. However, the foreign and trade policy of the United States must be mindful of the quandary that places the domestic cargo handling industry, particularly as it pertains to issues related to sustainability. This is another area that is of great significance to marine terminal operators, which is also directly related to the work of your committee. We all want to be good stewards of the environment and operate in a manner that has the least possible negative impact on the environment. However, obtaining new equipment from container gantry cranes, as you see behind you, to yard hustlers is a challenge for marine terminal operators. While most of our container cranes are now electrified, operators are in the process of seeking to replace cargo handling equipment, including rubber tire gantry cranes, top loaders, reach stackers, with low emission or zero emission equipment.
Mr. Atkins, we're 4 minutes over, so can we submit the rest of your testimony into the record? Because
Yes.
I want to make sure I'm as fair to all of the folks,
Okay.
but we appreciate you hosting us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
But, Mr. Heminger, would you please proceed?
Hemdale Farms and Greenhouses grows. Oops, there we go. Hemdale Farms and Greenhouses grows or produces milk for Upstate Milk Cooperative. We're one of the owners and the only supplier of fresh milk for Wegmans Food Market. They're very fussy. We also grow transplants to start vegetables for ourselves and 20 other farms, and then we grow a lot of cabbage. We have cabbage year-round. We ship 50 loads a week with a neighboring farm, July through November, and then about 10 loads a week, November through June, to fussy buyers who want our dense, crisp cabbage out of storage. Back home, my son and a great team of dedicated, hardworking employees are running a 1,500-cow high-tech dairy, as well as a greenhouse business that starts vegetables for transplants, 3,000 acres of crops, including fresh vegetables. I'm proud to say that besides myself, we have 5 of our 6 key managers that are partners, owners. International trade is of critical importance to our business. For the dairy industry, nearly 1 in 5 gallons of milk gets exported as a dairy product. This value is $10 billion a year. In the last 10 years, dairy exports have increased 52% by volume and 85% by dollars. 30 years ago, my farm was primarily a processing vegetable farm, and we had an outdated, older 100-cow dairy that my father had planned to sell off. Instead, I went to the bank and borrowed the money to expand to 300 cows, and that barn is still an important part of our operation today. At that time, the Canadian dairy market was scheduled to open under the original NAFTA agreement. It was actually a factor in my decision to expand my dairy. Over the last 30 years, the Canadian dairy industry has massively outsmarted numerous trade agreements, keeping their markets mostly closed to U.S. products. I'm just 90 miles from the bridge to get into Canada, and just a little bit past that is Toronto. Big population. Currently, I compete to sell large volumes of both vegetables, transplants, and fresh vegetables with the same production grown in Canada. The primary supplier of fresh vegetable plants in the Northeast is Canadian Greenhouses. I'm one of the few larger size greenhouses that have tried to be as competitive with them because of all the opportunities they have. Canadian subsidies, including trucking for export subsidies, investment grants, and government-controlled low-cost inputs like energy, make them more competitive. I respect my Canadian greenhouse competitors. We make each other better. Now Canada must let us send our dairy products and vegetables back to the same open borders. On the input side of our business, last year was the craziest year of my 45-year career, led by fertilizer prices that were up 100% to 300% and fuel prices that were up 70 to 100%. Today, fertilizer settled back to an average of 70 to 80% higher than 2021. It hasn't settled back further, my supplier tells me, because Russia and China are internally restricting exports, keeping supplies tight worldwide, and hence prices historically high. Fuel prices are back to a more traditional range. Almost all other costs are higher, including machinery, repair parts, and some supplies. Moving forward, our biggest challenge to remain competitive is labor. Our first labor challenge is the federal H-2A program that I've participated in since its inception 15 years ago. The current administration has let the U.S. Department of Labor be out of control with regulations, fees, and base wage requirements. Canada and Mexico are increasing production, knowing they can produce many products cheaper than those of us in the United States trying to do that with these labor costs. My second labor issue is New York's new labor laws and regulations that are making our costs much higher than neighboring states and Canada. In 2023, when I paid the New York State mandated overtime that for agriculture was new 2 years ago, the federal H-2A hourly rate of $16.95 an hour. When I pay overtime on those dollars, my labor costs will be double what Canada pays with no overtime mandated. Last Friday, during a statewide meeting of Farm Bureau leaders reviewing the new labor regulations that were just enacted with the new New York State budget, an apple farmer that I have great respect for said he and his neighbors were organizing to entertain solar project development on their farm acreage. This is on some of the best fruit acreage in the world. Picture the beautiful land that borders Lake Ontario in Western New York being converted from apple trees to solar panels. At Hemdale Farms, we are focused on soil-based solutions. 30 years ago, my primary focus was growing vegetables for processing for Birds Eye Foods. A combination of the consolidation of the industry and the high cost of doing business in New York State forced Birds Eye to sell all the processing plants, and today they're importing a considerable amount of their products from countries with much lower costs. I share this because at that time, Birds Eye asked me to transition some acreage to organic so they could do test marketing. The Birds Eye markets didn't develop, but we established numerous markets for both vegetables and grain and were successful organic growers for 15 years. Eventually, my operation partner, who was a self-trained soil health expert, and I decided to discontinue organic production because of ongoing challenges maintaining the land and controlling weeds and seed growth with excess tillage. We also wanted to be able to consider GMO in the use of all our enterprises. My lifetime of experience has me convinced that GMOs are the most important scientific breakthrough in history for the future of feeding a hungry world of 8 billion people. I will wrap this up saying that Hemdale Farms is up to the challenge of competing in global markets. We will continue to move forward with an entrepreneurial spirit, finding our niches to succeed. However, we must have a level playing field with open markets and cost structure where we can be competitive with both our income and expenses. If this is not the case, I owe it to my family and my community to change my focus and possibly my location. Money goes where money can be made. Chairman Smith and committee members, I commend you for convening these hearings on behalf of agriculture and small business across the country. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Turkle, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and honorable members of the committee. I'm honored to be here with you today to testify on key red flags in our trade relationship with China. In 2019, as leaked documents show, the Xinjiang government supercharged its policy to pull all Uyghurs in a mandatory work placement. To be clear, it is a state policy that all Uyghurs must be in forced labor. Acting on forced labor imports as a moral imperative, as the Uyghur genocide has entered its 7th year. American consumers are increasingly aware that our proclaimed national values are not aligning with U.S. corporate interests abroad. Ignoring modern-day slavery is morally unacceptable. It compromises the soul of our nation and sets a malign precedent globally. I was born in a re-education camp where my mother was sent to at the height of China's infamous Cultural Revolution. My father had been sent to a separate forced labor camp. I grew up witnessing Uyghur villagers forced to build irrigation system and pick cotton. Uyghur forced labor is not a new problem. The return of re-education camps and forced labor on an industrial scale is a morally abhorrent practice that demands a response backed by political will. The Chinese government is using forced labor to break up Uyghur families and send them to work in factories thousands of miles away from home. These Uyghurs are prisoners of the state, and their labor is being used to make products for domestic and international markets. Uyghurs are suffering under the state plan targeting an ethno-religious groups for industrial forced labor on a scale not seen since the Holocaust era. Forced labor is driving the near complete erasure of Uyghur people from within a generation. This practice is at the profit-making center of atrocity crimes. I'm sure you can imagine the psychological impact on me as a proud American to know that my country is profiting from the Uyghur forced labor. Knowing that my own dollars might be spent on goods produced with the slavery of my own friends and people is sick and cruel reality. The problem is not going to disappear or even be minimized. As China becomes more hostile to foreign businesses as the means of concealing the origin of goods continue to evolve, effective enforcement from the relevant authorities will be essential to protect our nation's economic interest. Forced labor transfer within China and beyond will likewise necessitate closer scrutiny. And American workers are at disadvantage when competing with countries that uses forced labor. Let's be clear, forced labor is the profit-making dimension of an ongoing genocide. Business complicity must be taken completely off the table. Modern-day state-imposed slave labor in China is America's #1 source of imports. The existing laws must be fully enforced and even amended to ensure that American people are not unwittingly complicit in powering a genocide with their dollars. In closing, I'd like to make the following recommendations. First, this committee should conduct robust oversight hearing on the implementation of the UFLPA. Second, Congress should continue to increase funding for UFLPA enforcement. Third, this committee should examine the composition and role of Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee, COAC, which heavily favors the importer community while excluding domestic producers and American workers. Fourth, Congress should pass robust and enforceable country of origin labeling rules. Fifth, Congress should pass new legislation modeled on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to address business complicity in state-imposed forced labor, human trafficking, war crimes, and other serious human rights atrocities. Six, Congress should amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to address the corrupt practices of foreign adversaries. Seventh, Congress should pass legislation prohibiting access to U.S. capital markets by maligning foreign adversary companies under U.S. sanctions for human rights or national security reasons. The fifth, Congress should pass TSP Fiduciary Security Act to update the fiduciary duty of Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. Finally, Congress should pass the Turn Off the Tap Act to create a central ban on federal funds going to foreign firms explicitly identified through U.S. government backlist. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Romano is recognized.
Good morning, Chairman, Ranking Member, and members. Today, I'd like to discuss the negative impact of trade practices on the titanium dioxide industry. I serve as the co-CEO of Tronox Holdings, the world's leading vertically integrated producer of titanium dioxide, also known as TiO2. Our product is a base pigment that can be found in virtually all paints and coatings applications such as architectural, industrial, automotive, aerospace, and military applications. It is also a key pigment that adds whiteness and opacity to many plastics products and is critical to nearly everything that is manufactured in this country. We operate the world's 5th largest production facility of TiO2 in Hamilton, Mississippi, and in Oklahoma City we operate a world-class R&D center. As a vertically integrated producer, we mine titanium-bearing ores at our 5 mines in South Africa and Australia, and we upgrade that ore to high-grade feedstock and ship it to our 9 TiO2 facilities around the world. Our mines also produce valuable co-products, including the types of rare earth minerals that have been identified as critical minerals under Executive Order 13817 and 14017. Tronox is now considering using its existing mineral resources in South Africa and Australia as a feedstock for rare earth processing at a plant in Hamilton, Mississippi, to supply U.S.-based customers and potentially the U.S. government. The threat from China is clear, both to our core TiO2 business as well as any plans as we may have to move into the rare earth mineral space. While China accounted for 36% of the global TiO2 production a decade ago, today it accounts for 52%. And China's attempts to dominate the global supply of TiO2 are continuing to evolve. Based on our analysis of announced new plants, China's production could account for 70% of the global demand by 2030, with growth in Chinese production far exceeding growth in global demand. At a recent conference at one of the largest Chinese producers of TiO2 predicted that its company's growth would result in the removal of Western capacity suppliers. In other words, we're seeing the classic Chinese playbook of creating enormous overcapacity to harm foreign competitors. The Chinese have also sought to appropriate U.S. TiO2 technology through criminal means. In 2014, a federal jury in San Francisco found 2 individuals and 1 state-owned entity guilty of economic espionage and theft of TiO2 trade secrets. Many Chinese producers are either part or wholly state-owned, and there's discriminatory application of bankruptcy laws which keeps failing firms propped up, preventing them from shutting down the unprofitable producers. In our African mining activities, we see a sharp contrast between Tronox and how the Chinese mine titanium-bearing ores. In South Africa, we employ approximately 22 individuals, where we mine ore and we operate sophisticated mineral separation and smelting operations which produce high-quality titanium feedstock and pig iron, much of which is shipped to the United States. Our mine closure plans are world-class, requiring the restoration of the local area's natural flora and fauna. China's exploitation of Africa's titanium mineral resources is far different. As China exhausts its own titanium resources, it has turned increasingly to Mozambique, where it exports huge quantities of unprocessed ore to China for mineral separation and upgrading. Not only are its mining practices far less sustainable than ours, but it lacks the in-country processing which deprives local communities of employment and development opportunities. One of the primary reasons the United States TiO2 industry remains strong is attributable to a decisive action taken by USTR under Section 301. Since the initiation of Section 301, U.S. TiO2 production has decreased by less than 10%, and imports of Chinese material have halved. If you compare that in contrast to the European Union, where capacity has been reduced by 22%, and exports of Chinese material into the EU have increased 82%. USTR Section 301 action has enabled U.S. producers like Tronox to remain viable. This in turn has generated enormous benefits for the local communities where we operate, enabling Tronox to consider investments in adjacent industries like rare earth minerals. Tronox continues to invest heavily to remain competitive, but we are concerned that with a significant increase of Chinese TiO2 capacity, current Section 301 tariffs may not be enough to prevent uneven playing fields in the U.S. markets. In closing, I would ask that as part of the four-year review of actions under Section 301, USTR consider whether current tariff levels are sufficient to avoid injury to our industry. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. O'Shea?
Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Neal and all members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Tom O'Shea, and I'm the president of the United Steelworkers Local 135L, which represents workers at the Sumitomo Tire Plant in Buffalo, New York. Our plant employs over 1,400 people, including 1,100 members of the United Steelworkers. I've worked at the plant for 33 years now, mostly building tires. We build a wide range of tires from motorcycle to passenger vehicle tires. We also export to Europe. We are looking to add tire capacity that will allow our location to build up to 17,500 tires per day. I can sit before you today talking about expansion and tell you that I recently posted on my Facebook page about job openings at the plant that start at $25.33 an hour with excellent benefits. Not just because of our union contract, but also because the United Steelworkers fought against illegally dumped and subsidized imports. For the last 14 years, the union has used every tool in the toolbox to defend a domestic industry which has manufacturing facilities in 19 states and employs nearly 100,000 workers. Since the United Steelworkers has significant density in the tire industry, we are able to file trade cases without employers. Since many tire manufacturers in the U.S. are global manufacturers, there is a hesitancy in filing trade cases because of potential retaliation. But for the union, this is about our jobs and a level playing field. The union filed the only successful 421 petition against China in 2009 that lasted until 2012 on passenger vehicle and light truck tires. Then in 2014, the union filed an anti-dumping and countervailing duty case because when the 421 relief expired, Chinese producers flooded the U.S. market with imports going from about 24 million units to more than 50 million. The reason for the gap between 2012 and our trade case filing in 2014 is because our trade laws require showing 3 years of harm before we can win at the ITC. We won that PVLT tire case in 2015, which continues today. The union later won a trade case on bus and truck tires from China in 2017 and joined Titan Tire in winning trade cases for off-the-road tires as well. Finally, in 2021, the union won a follow-on case against 4 countries on PVLT tires. All told, there have been 12 cases that have led to duties on 6 different countries. Millions of dollars and thousands of hours have been spent defending American workers because we believe in fair trade. However, Congress could do more to ensure a level playing field. First, after 12 trade cases won against 6 countries, what more evidence does Congress need to see that tire products are an import-sensitive commodity? Congress should add tires to the GSP import-sensitive list. We should not unilaterally drop tariffs on tires when, for example, a Chinese tire company invested nearly $1 billion into a GSP country, which could come here tariff-free. We need to make it easier to address third country subsidies like China's Belt and Road Initiative. We need to recognize that global companies can quickly shift dumping from one country to another, undermining U.S. manufacturing jobs. Congress could help this by passing bills like Level the Playing Field Act 2.0, introduced last Congress by Representatives Terry Sewell and Bill Johnson. Second, workers negatively impacted by trade should have access to training programs like trade adjustment assistance. Finally, we should not impose budget cuts on the agencies that enforce our trade laws. Unfortunately, recent House-passed legislation would decrease the budgets of agencies which enforce our trade laws by over $60 million. Millions of workers rely on our government to accurately review trade cases, and federal budget cuts will lead to lost manufacturing jobs. My written testimony includes more examples of policy tools that could make American jobs more competitive in a global marketplace. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
I want to thank you all for your excellent testimony, and we'll now proceed to the question and answer session. And I'll begin first. Mr. Turkle, America has led the world by banning the import of products made with forced labor. I was proud to vote in 2015 to update our forced labor import ban, and again in 2021 to pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to address the unprecedented scale of the Chinese Communist Party's systematic use of forced labor. And yet there are credible reports of products made with forced labor still entering the United States. What more can we do through our trade policies to shine a light on China's human rights abuses and crack down on products manufactured from forced labor entering the U.S.?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the question. We can do a number of things to address that concern. First of all, we have to look into the country of origin concern. The law, the UFLPA, specifically focuses on the Uyghur region that is formerly known as Xinjiang. But we do also know that there have been instances that the Chinese government supported entities making the product without labeling and taking to the inland and then exporting to another country and making to the United States. That includes Mexico and Canada. So we need to close the loophole, starting with the addressing the country of origin concern, making a new rule. And then two, we have to work with our partners and allies to encourage them to put in place similar type of legislative mandate. And Europe is about to becoming dumping ground for forced labor produced products. Italy, during the period of 2019 through 2020, increased import volume from Xinjiang almost by 200%. So the Europe needs to catch up, so as our Asian allies, Japan, Australia. And then finally, we have to continue to increase the enforcement mechanism in the United States with additional resources and tools. I know that Congress approved $70 million for enforcement. We have to continue to add funding so that our CBP colleagues can do their job. And finally, I would look into a possibility of amending the UFLPA to make it applicable to entire country, China. That one geographical area has been focused, but we may end up seeing human trafficking, internal migration.
Thank you. Mr. Romano, as you know, President Trump imposed tariffs on China because of its unfair trade practices under Section 301 of the 74 Trade Act. And President Biden has kept these tariffs in place so far, although his administration is currently conducting a 4-year review of the tariffs and may make changes as a result of that review. As a company that has had to deal directly with China's unfair trade practices, Can you speak to the relationship between these tariffs and the protection of American production and jobs?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, so I've been with the company that I'm working for now for 35 years, and we have historically seen plants close due to Chinese imports. So we had a plant in Savannah, Georgia, that closed in 2004, and the other half of that plant closed in 2007. And it was directly related to Chinese imports for, I'd say, a lower grade of TiO2 that was sold into the paper industry. We're not the only company that closed production. There was another facility in Delaware that closed for that. So how have those 301 tariffs impacted us since then? There hasn't been any capacity actually eliminated since the trade barriers were put in place, the tariffs on TiO2. And it's actually allowed us to expand our facility in Hamilton, Mississippi. We have spent $135 million, a 15% increase in capital spend since those tariffs were put into place. We have a $55 million payroll at that facility with 450 employees, about 120 to 150 contractors working at that facility every day as well. So it's not only helping us maintain our production globally, but it's also helping us maintain jobs. Many of our employees have been with the company for many years. It's generations. I said I've been with this company for 35 years. There's been somebody in my family that's worked for this company for 72 years. So the U.S. is a big part of what we do. That Hamilton facility that we have in Mississippi is our crown jewel, and we're looking at opportunities now to try to see how we might be able to expand that business into the rare earth space and take some of the resources we have out of South Africa and Australia and bring them to the United States for upgrading.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Heminger, trade enforcement is about making sure that our partners provide the access to markets that they were promised. Today, Canada is not meeting its obligations under USMCA as it relates to American dairy exports. If the U.S. fails to enforce obligations under our trade agreements on dairy products or any other, what does that mean for farmers such as yours or other businesses?
We just simply aren't going to be able to continue to compete when it's a one-way street. We need a level playing field, and the American public and people need to realize that, generally speaking, we're either going to be importing all our fruits or vegetables, or we're going to stand up for labor and equal opportunities for American farmers. Right today, like I said, we can't ship our milk to Canada. I expanded my dairy 30 years ago thinking that market would open up. But yet, at Hunts Point, right here in New York City in the Bronx, there's New York cabbage out of storage. My first attachment is the Hunts Point report from Friday. And on it, it shows a few products out of storage in Canada. You look at this again in July through November, every single product here will have a Canadian entry on it. At the same time, my milk can't go to Canada. It's just common sense.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Oshai, one quick question. In your opening statement, you made a comment about the Chinese investing in a company in a GSP nation. What's that country that you were referring to?
They're very clever in circumventing our trade laws. So a question like that, I have to think. And at this point, Serbia is the GSP country.
Okay. Thank you very much. I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Neal, for questions.
Thank you for Thank you for your informative testimony. The common theme is pretty clear: enforcement. I mean, everybody's nodding their heads in the affirmative as we say that. Mr. Oshai, in your testimony, you demonstrate the importance of enforcement of U.S. trade laws to protect domestic workers and manufacturers against many of these unfair practices of other countries, namely China. We know that without effective enforcement, trade liberalization measures can have a detrimental effect on America's workers and industries. Could you talk briefly about how trade enforcement benefits workers like those that you represent at the tire manufacturing plant in Tonawanda, New York? And wouldn't the proposed budget cuts that you referenced be of great harm to trade enforcement?
Ranking Member Neal, thank you for the question. I believe they would. We could see before the 421 case in 2009 that there was tire plants closing every year in the United States. We could not compete with all the tires that were being illegally dumped in the United States. And 2013, when those expired, we started to feel it again. But once that second trade case went through and was properly enforced, rather than seeing tire plants shutting down across the United States, you've seen them being built again in the United States, employment going up, and offending countries actually building plants in the United States, employing American workers. So that is a big impact for us, but we also have seen where they would shift production to countries like Vietnam to avoid tariffs, or export tires to other countries and try and send them to the United States tariff-free. So it's a constant shell game they're playing, and without the money for representatives to enforce our trade laws, they'll start getting away with that again.
Thank you. And follow-up, Mr. Scheid, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act for Workers has provided workers adversely affected by trade with opportunities to gain new skills and credentials and the support needed to rebuild skills and future jobs. This is an ideal opportunity for community colleges across the country to address those who, because of trade economics that have offered dislocations, an opportunity to get back into the workforce with upgraded skills. The program expired last year. We've been pushing very hard on this side for the Department of Labor to begin the process of putting together legislation that would come to the assistance of those who have been unfairly impacted. So in the Competes Act, we were all in. We need to get our other side here to enjoy the same enthusiasm we do as it relates to trade adjustment assistance. Can you reference how that has worked in your area?
At our plant in 2010, we had a big layoff. Truck and bus tires were under a lot of duress from Chinese imports. We had a big layoff. The intent was to eventually shut the plant down because we were under so much pressure from those imports, and we didn't see a recovery coming. We filed. Our members received TAA. Eventually, through luck and hard work, we did return those workers to work after over a year of layoff, but during that year, they had received enhanced unemployment benefits, so they did not run out of unemployment, which gave them the opportunity. Many of our members had gone for welding certificates. We had some members who had their first year of nursing degree. And you could see if we had not come back up without luck and hard work, people were on their way to being able to at least get decent employment after the plant would have closed.
Mr. Chairman, the trade component to American economic life at once enjoyed great support. It is now severely diminished, and much of it is because of the dislocated workers and workforce across the country and some of the trade practices that international competitors offer. It's a really important part of our economic agenda, but you can see the constituency for it in America has considerably shrunk over the years, and I think that this is something through enforcement that we can hope to change.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Recognize the gentleman, a gentle lady, Ms. Malatakis.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your testimony. This hearing is critically important because we need to implement common sense, pro-growth tax and trade policies that will boost our economy, the businesses like those here today, and the American worker. I want to thank the International Longshoremen Association for being present here and the work that they do at this port. Steelworkers Union, thank you and your members for what they do. And of course, our Port Authority police who are here to keep our port safe. I want to start with Mr. Atkins. While many industries were eventually able to return to former habits post-pandemic, the seaports continue to grapple with altered consumer patterns and a shifting global supply crisis. How do seaports continue to adapt to these supply chain patterns that have emerged post-pandemic?
As everyone has noticed on the way down to the site here, that we're pretty wide open. at our facility here. Our volume year over year is down about 42% at this facility. If you look at what our volume is now over 2019, we're down about 15%. So what we're grappling with here is the consumer reaction post-pandemic. Once the pandemic hit and people were working from home, online purchasing went up dramatically. The shippers and the folks that own the cargo that everybody goes online and buys flooded the shores with material that we saw here. That added to the congestion that we saw going through all the ports and all the facilities. Now that things have returned back to whatever this new normal is, a lot of the cargo owners that had rushed to ramping up their supplies are now working down that inventory. So we see the decrease in numbers for the inventory work down that you see. And right now, the interest rates on mortgages and that you see on any kind of consumer credit is impacting one of the biggest purchasing areas, and that's home goods. Furniture by commodity is the #1 mover into the country, and with interest rates as high as they are for 30-year mortgages, people are not looking to trade in their 2 or 3% mortgage into larger houses or build new houses. So if you look at the furniture and home goods sector, that is down dramatically.
So you mentioned some of the causes of this,
Yeah.
say, freight recession.
Sure.
What are some of the policies that you would like to see implemented that would help get this economy back on track, maybe pausing the interest rates and better trade policies to export more to build our GDP? What would you say are some of the things that could help?
Any of the beneficial moves that can be made to incentivize the export market will help not just the American worker, but will help the ports that we see here today. And overall, just the more we are tied so tightly to consumerism that, a healthier economy is what brings that through. So anything we can do to get more people employed, through the trade policies or whether it's enforcement, anything that gets people to work gets money into the economy system.
Great. How can we help streamline the process and ensure that American businesses and workers have a reliable system to prevent delays at the ports that hurt both exporters and the port's bottom line?
Yeah, well, actually, there's many stakeholders in the supply chain that have to help with that. It was the inland distribution that caused a lot of what we saw during the pandemic and the supply chain crisis. Warehouses were full, distribution networks were full, so we saw that cargo back up into the ports. So anything when you look at these large warehouse complexes, there just was not enough of them. And talking to our friends in the warehouse industry, there are a lot of regions that it does take quite a bit of, I won't say legislation, but maneuvering through the local ordinances and county ordinances just to get more warehouses built, to be able to get more cargo and velocity moving.
Well, thank you very much. The House Republicans have put forward some great ideas on how we can reignite our economy, get people back to work, work requirements for some public benefits. If they're able-bodied, they could help stimulate the economy, work, produce, and I think that would help resolve some of your problems if we also do that in conjunction with smart pro-growth tax and trade policy, which we hope to work on a bipartisan manner. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses. I just know I grew up as a blue-collar kid and been in business 30 years before I got here. We've got to come together. The time is now. And when I mean that, I mean business and unions. My parents were union workers all their life. You got good paying benefits here. I mean, we're talking about we were sharing $150,000 in terms of all in. That's great benefits. And then we got to have the governance come in and make a difference. So I just want to say that. I know we can. I've been to 80 countries in the world. I've done business abroad. We've got the best and most able people, but we need a shared vision. We need a shared plan, and we need to work together and make it happen and leave nobody behind. So I just want to get that out of the way because I feel very strong about it. International trade obviously is critical. I'll just say I've got a seaport in Florida, Tampa Bay area. It's actually Manatee County. We're up 35%. I'm not saying because of one reason or another, but I was looking at the numbers and we're up 35%. Ports in Florida, we have 15. And 1 in 5 jobs is trade related in terms of Florida. 107, you know this, what this number means better than I do, but 107 million tons of cargo was moved last year in Florida. And so that's come up, and I know some people get tired of hearing about Florida. I'm from Detroit originally, but my point is that they're moving in the right direction. We're going to have a delegation meeting, Greg and myself and others, to meet with all our ports in the very near future. We're going to talk about what more can we do? What more can we do to help? Because these are good paying jobs, and it's very important. The other thing I just want to say in terms of FTAs, free trade agreements, we need to find a way we can work together. USMCA, I thought, was a good blueprint that we came together on. We had 380 votes, so we've got to make sure that we're doing that. I think in terms of the UK, the EU, if you want to deal, it's just my opinion, I'm not an expert, but if you want to deal with China, you've got to find a way to work with the EU. That seems like we have a lot of shared values. They get good benefits, get the month of August off from work, so they got some really good positive things. We've got to find a way, if we can't come together, I think that'll make a big difference in terms of having an ally. Let me share this with you, is that a lot of people, you know it, but maybe you haven't thought about it. But I was on a trip this week and someone brought up, we got 8 billion people on the planet now. So let's say the United States is 350 million, but 8 billion, that's a lot of opportunity. And we've got to make sure we get our fair share, but we do, as someone mentioned, you know, a lot of them don't play the game right. We'll talk about that in a minute. But USTA, Bob Lighthizer, and Richie knows, we worked together and we got that. We got 380 votes out of there. We need to go to work and make some differences. The other thing I'll just tell you, someone said about free trade, I'm a free trader, but it needs to be fair. And I personally feel like we've been played, and I'm a Republican. So let me just tell you that. I just feel strongly about that. Obviously, with China, we've been played for a lot of years. And I'll say we got other good friends, even the Japanese. And I do business with the Japanese over the years. But we've been played there as well. At the end of the day, it needs to be somewhat fair, however you want to look at that. So that's just my strong feelings with that. I just got off yesterday the plane at 4 o'clock on a Codell, and we met with Korea, Indonesia, Jakarta, Poland, and one of the countries, North Macedonia. So anyway, met with 4 or 5 different countries, and the bottom line is that all of them were very enthused about us. We need to be engaged. We need to be working together, and a lot of them were business groups that we met with. Not all of them, but usually the receptions at night were business groups, and we had a lot of good dialogue, and they realized that our embassies were there, American business people were there, and they're making some progress, but they need more help, because if they do better, in a sense that way, it also helps us out as well. John, I wanted to mention, Mr. Atkins, a little bit. You said your business is down 42%. What's creating that? Because I really do want to better understand that. Is that the market? I don't think it's all the market. There's probably other factors, but I think we need to know what those other factors are so we can be helpful.
Yeah. It's partially driven by the trade lanes that you service at your individual terminal, the ones that we have here, with Far East trade, with China being so far off with the reduction in consumer purchasing here. It probably took it did take a more drastic hit than some of the other facilities that have more diversified services, let's say transatlantic or South America trade lanes. They tend to be more resilient because out of South America you're bringing fruits, vegetables, food stuff, those type commodities. So this facility that we're in today suffered more than probably the other ones in the harbor based on the services that it has.
As you've been asked, let's figure out how we can be helpful.
Yes.
And Mr. Turnbull, Let me ask you, as it relates to intellectual properties, IP, 30 years ago, I was in Beijing, and we were talking about that being a big, big factor. Can you hear me now? Okay. IP, intellectual properties, 30 years ago, I was in Beijing with a group of business people, and that was the biggest issue back then, and I don't think it's got a lot better today with the Chinese in terms of intellectual properties. What's your thoughts about how can we turn that around and get that where it makes more sense, or can we?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I think we have to acknowledge something important, and our policymakers not being straightforward with American people, that what we're dealing is a regime.
Can you speak in the mic a little bit more? Because
What we're dealing here is a regime that enslaves its own population, subsidize key industries, making it impossible for American companies to compete fairly, and also steal our technology. This is one of their methods, been ongoing for a long, long time. So I know it's a very complicated question, but this is something that I've been advocating that the United States government that needs to go hard, tough in its dealing with the Chinese regime.
Okay. Mr. Romano, let me ask you, you talked about minerals. I was just in Jakarta, Indonesia, met with the president, myself, members of Congress. They've got a lot of minerals, things that we need. People are very active and engaged there. Of course, the Chinese are at the front of the line. But we've got to find a way. They don't want to, they've got to do some business like all those countries do with the Chinese, but they don't trust them, don't want to work with them if they don't have to. But they made it very clear we need to be there. And of course, when we go down, looking down the road in terms of EV vehicles and everything else, they have a lot of those minerals there. What's your thought on what we need to be doing?
Yeah, so we are a large miner. We have 5 mines in Australia and South Africa. And so the mineral, those minerals also contain rare earths. And historically, what we've done with those rare earth minerals is ship them as tailings to China, and they've upgraded those into rare earth oxides and ultimately into magnets. So we are now looking at exporting that material to the U.S., to our facility in Hamilton, Mississippi, so that we can actually participate.
We're going to have to. We're
way
over
over
time.
I didn't see the light there.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for your patience in bringing us together. There's one area that I think this committee ought to be able to get their arms around. And I appreciate Mr. Turkle and Mr. Oshai talking specifically about the de minimis loophole. Mr. Turkle, you talk about how this is used to allow goods used by forced labor to come to the country. You have excellent testimony. You didn't have a chance to speak to it in just your 5 minutes, but I would commend the committee to look at Mr. Turkle's page 10 and 11 about the abuses here and the impact by allowing over 2 million packages a day, uninspected, untariffed, to flow into the United States. Mr. Turkle, do you want to talk about what you might have added if you had time for your testimony?
Yes, I would like to point out that this is a serious problem. For example, one half were shipped with 0 digital data provided to U.S. Customs authorities.
Could you speak a little closer into the microphone?
Yes.
You're hard to hear you.
1/4 of those flagged for inspection were never inspected because the importer failed to comply with the order to hold items for inspection. And then 1/4 of those inspected, I'm talking about de minimis, those 2 million packages coming to the United States, 1/4 of those inspected at JFK Airport had some type of violations. So we need to look at why we have this loophole continued. One company that have been in the question is the Shein. That is it is one of the most successful Chinese companies, even though their headquarters in Singapore. The download of this app has surpassed already TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. So that shows that this is one of the most effective tools that the Chinese entities is using by taking advantage of the de minimis rule. We need to consider looking at the possibility of changing the dollar amount. 200, you mentioned, I
Right.
mentioned 2 million, but yesterday I was looking at other records. One of the world's foremost expert on this issue, Dr. Laura Murphy, testified in Congress. She said 3 million. So that's a daily package coming into the United States. That's a big loophole that we need to close.
I appreciate that very much. I do hope that there's an opportunity for the committee to look at this huge volume of uninspected. I mean, we're here in New York, the home of exploding electric bike batteries. There are $799 e-bikes coming through under this loophole. And I just think it's a simple fix. It would be broadly supported on a bipartisan basis, and it's not just clothing. Mr. Ashai, you mentioned the potential use of the de minimis loophole in your testimony about tires. The possibility, perhaps, of a company shipping tires direct to consumers 4 at a time?
Yeah, it only makes sense. They found every loophole they could to get around, our trade laws and trade cases, and you could get a set of 4 tires shipped here, less than $800, and put them on the road, and they wouldn't be following our Department of Transportation rules either. It's, it's another way of cheating our trade laws, and it's dangerous.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll try and help you get back on schedule here. I'm not going to deal with your patience, but I think this is something that the committee needs to look at. We see companies use what is called creative invoicing, that if what the product you're getting actually costs $800 or more, let us work with you, and we'll find a way to get that invoice under $800 to be uninspected and tariffed. These are dangerous. It undercuts American business. There are actions of forced labor that come through using this loophole. And I just urge the committee to look at the testimony from our 2 witnesses that zero in on the de minimis, because I do think this is, the legislation that I'm going to reintroduce would only exclude a non-market economy that's on the watch list. And that's, that's China. And I think they should actually be excluded. It's a small signal that we're not going to be overrun, but this loophole is swallowing the exception in ways that are really detrimental to American business and the safety of American consumers. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. It appears that that loophole is almost an $800 free trade agreement for China for any products underneath that. That's what it looks like to me. Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses, certainly for your unique perspectives, but also expressing common concerns. And as we sit here, it's a very relevant place that we would be here at a port as a representative from Nebraska, the #1 agriculture district in the U.S. House. Trade is important. Getting products out of our country to other markets is important, and to do so reliably. And the reverse of that, too, we know is important, whether it's fertilizer, other products, be it for agriculture specifically or our economy in general. So we saw such difficulties during COVID that further complicated what was already a problem. Mr. Atkins, can you outline for us what you believe were the specific choke points here at GCT in moving goods during COVID and how you overcame them? And then if you have any insight in ways we might be able to alleviate them in the future.
Sure. Thank you, Representative Smith. Where we saw the choke points were the long dwell times of the imports that were coming off the ship. There were a few reasons that was created. #1 was some warehouses just did not have enough space to bring the containers out and put the cargo into the warehouse because they were full. Their parking lots were full with other imported containers. So they tended to sit here and dwell at any of these facilities for a longer than average period of time. There was also an issue with lack of chassis. Those are the sets of wheels that detach from the container and actually move. Where were all the chassis? They were tied up in the parking lots of all the shippers with loads on them that they could not unload them and get the empties back in time to return the empty and pick up the next one. So it was a chassis issue, it was a space constraint issue, and it really just backed up the pipeline into the ports and went beyond that to the point that for most of 2022, the Port of New York had on average about 15 to 17 ships at Anchorage waiting to come in, and they could not come in and discharge the goods because there were no room at the facilities. So now you see, driving down here today, time has somewhat resolved that issue. You see not enough cargo coming in. There's plenty of space now. There's plenty of chassis that are available. So it was working down inventories that has helped that, and also the purchasing volume has just gone down over the pandemic time period.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Romano, you've spoken about the vertical integration at Tronox and the importance of raw materials in Africa and Australia. Can you tell us about what you've seen regarding, or further tell us what you've seen regarding the Chinese attempts to aggressively secure the raw material resources globally so that they can control and exploit those?
Thank you for the question. So yes, historically, you would have, so Australia, I mentioned we are a big miner in Australia, and you get a lot of junior miners in Australia that have historically not only mined, but they've upgraded that raw material. What you're seeing now is a lot of these junior miners are getting interest from the Chinese, so they buy into these companies, get board seats, and in many instances, they're getting 100% offtake rights to the material. So I mentioned Mozambique. It's another good example where they're running out of titanium in China in the minerals that they mine. So in Mozambique, they go in there, they buy the mining rights. They are taking the raw material in a form of which is called heavy mineral concentrate. It's not upgraded. Then they ship everything back to China to be upgraded and processed. For us as a miner, we have very strict rules on how we actually have to take the mining work that we do and then put the property that we mine on back to its normal, the way it came, the natural flora and fauna. That's a significant disadvantage that we have, an advantage they have because of the unfair practice that they are using by going and exploiting other countries to get raw materials to send back to China.
Okay. Mr. Heminger, just briefly, in the interest of time, can you perhaps reflect on the need for enforceable trade agreements and maybe touching upon USMCA in addressing Canada's dairy tariff rate quota system?
It seems like close the loophole seems to be the common theme here today, and that's certainly the case there, I think. In my attachment number 3 with my testimony, the CEO of our milk co-op, Upstate Niagara Co-op, articulately explains the issues, and it's really confounding that for 30 years this has gone on. I have thought numerous times this was going to be enforced in the next 2 or 3 years, but somehow they cleverly keeps figuring out a way to not live up to their side of the agreement.
Well said. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Stubbe is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Heminger, we'll stay with you. Thank you for your testimony today, and I agree with you that American farmers are losing a competitive edge on the global marketplace. It seems like there are 2 parts to this problem. First, other countries are stacking the deck against American imports, whether that is Mexico banning certain GMO crops or Canadian subsidies to undercut American farmers. But perhaps more importantly, our government isn't doing enough to help American businesses, farmers in particular. We are imposing ridiculous regulatory burdens on labor, environmental standards, and a laundry list of other areas. We have created a policy towards farmers that is definitely not America first. In your testimony, you said money goes where money can be made. With that in mind, do you have any further examples or predictions going forward of how states like New York or America in general are losing agriculture production and resources to competitors because of bad policy?
Well, thank you for the question, and I'm very concerned. We are just stacking the deck against the American farmer. particularly those that have more intensive labor needs with fruits and vegetables and dairy. I believe that in New York State, where we're a little more traditional with family farms that would have a handful of employees or maybe even 10 or 15, that the regulations are looking at that they're going to get pushed out of business. I'm scared for them. I have a little more mechanized, but as I learned in the processing vegetable business when I was the major shipper for Bird's Eye Foods, being the last guy standing doesn't make you very smart. Everybody else moved on first. And fortunately, I stayed in the dairy business, and that's my primary business today, along with the cabbage. But we have to do something to stay competitive. I mean, there's talk of an E-Verify system in Washington right now. Folks, 70 or 80% of the employees on dairy farms in the United States will struggle with an E-Verify system. The hospitality business and food businesses in a lot of our big cities, this didn't happen overnight. It's evolved over the last 30 years. And we need to listen to small business and hear them and understand that we need a comprehensive immigration bill that addresses this. Some of the finest families in my community, or my employees with me for 20 years, that I'm not sure they can live up to an E-Verify system. And it's a very, very big concern. As far as GMO and whatnot, I mean, it's just a playing card by Mexico right now. There is absolutely no validity at all in any of their concerns about GMO. Sound science is how we're put together, doing our cropping and whatnot with as minimal a carbon footprint as possible, with a lot of cover crops is what we're about. And with that, we need modern farming practices.
Yeah, and I've seen it in my own district in Florida. We've seen it after NAFTA was passed. We've lost tomato growers because they can obviously produce it a lot cheaper without the labor standards, without the environmental standards in Mexico than they can here in the United States. In general, American farmers and businesses follow the rules. If something is prohibited, they don't do it. But in Mexico or in China, rules and bans are more of suggestions. When something is banned in Mexico or China, it often just means someone needs to be bribed. Businesses don't really play by the rules. This is also true for environmental and human rights regulations as well. Mr. Romano and Mr. Heminger, if you want to touch on it too, can you speak to the unlevel playing field created when countries like Mexico and China implement rules that are followed by American businesses but aren't actually enforced against or followed by their own businesses? Mr. Romano.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question when you think about how we're producing in the United States. Specifically, we actually have a plant in China as well. So when we think about how we bought that plant back in 2019 in part of another acquisition, and that's a small facility that we struggle to compete with because when we, using our technology and our resources the way we need to invest in the U.S., we use those same principles in China, and we find that we're very uncompetitive because of the things that we're doing as we manage our production to ensure that we're treating the environment the appropriate way.
Well, and you spoke about the need to consider increased tariffs on China in regards to the titanium dioxide. Can you speak further as to why, and when dealing with unscrupulous trading partners such as China, a simple free market approach doesn't always work and economic tools such as tariffs are necessary?
Yes, so I mentioned that as the tariffs have been put in place, exports into the U.S. have halved. I'll give you another example of another country that's a big, where we supply a lot of material into is in India. So in that same time frame, India has a market that consumes about 400,000 tons a year. Imports in 2017 were 89,000 tons. They're now 210,000 tons. So the import duties that have been put in place along with the 301 have helped us manage our business, and we struggle to do that in Europe as well. So Europe is another country that we've got 3 production facilities in, and the Chinese imports in that area have gone up 82% since 2017.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. Mr. Pasquarello.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ashai, I want to start off with a couple of quick questions, if you will. Should Congress make it easier for unions to file trade petitions by lowering minimum percentage thresholds for a union to show interest in anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases?
I agree with that statement. Thank you for the question, Mr. Pascal. For the most part, especially in our industry, most of the major tire manufacturers in the United States have plants in China, and they don't want to get anywhere near a trade case that we bring to the International Trade Commission because they all fear repercussion. And, you know, talking to our legislative representatives, they're not inexpensive cases to bring. And when we go before the ITC, China has the best lawyers money can buy. They're very hard to prove. They don't give up the information easy. I believe our most expensive case might have been truck and bus. It was $3 million to bring in. They don't get that type of dues money from all the union rubber workers in the U.S. combined in a year.
My second question is, trade cases cost a lot of time, a lot of money. If you want to file, that's what you got to look forward to. How should the federal government support easing this complicated process for smaller companies and unions? Just quickly, give me an idea of what you see ahead, you would like to see ahead.
What we'd like to see is, number one, a way where you don't have to show 3 years of injury before you bring a case, because usually by that time you may be so damaged you never recover. But also, you know, it would be nice to see maybe even if the government could bring cases for us, or representatives, or, you know, smaller companies not having, you know, the money to bring a case, have some sort of advocacy there for them. But, you know, we actually had one case where a major tire company testified against us because they made the type of tire overseas.
Thank you for your brief responses. We need to talk a lot more about that, because I think something can be done in this area for everybody's health. And welcome to everybody. Witnesses were excellent, Mr. Chairman. All of them, you look back at their records, and they've done about everything. And I don't know how long you lasted in his business, Mr. Atkins, 30 years, but it's not bad. Congratulations. Working with both business and labor. Not an easy task, but one worthwhile for the economy, I believe. Nearly 40% of the nation's population live in the tri-state area. Yes. So welcome. Having a field hearing here at the busy port of New York and New Jersey is definitely welcome. We're just a golf shot from the Garden State. Right, happy to show the committee more real folks living in Paterson, New Jersey, my hometown. The operations at global container terminals underscore the vital role the federal government plays in a vibrant economy. The federal government worked with the Port Authority on a $1.8 billion dredging project there. This project ensured the terminals would welcome big ships with speed and efficiency. That was the promise. Strong federal partnership with the Army Corps dredged our region's harbor 50 feet. Correct me if I'm wrong. It helped us maintain our leading global shipping destination. But the Army Corps was a valuable agency to what you were trying to do with this port. But considering their budget plan, the other side, I respect deeply, but it doesn't make sense, because we have to agree in order to do what we promised, which we did not do. Just 13 days ago, we passed a terrible plan that hacks federal spending by at least 22%. This would be the biggest cut to non-defense programs in our history. Republicans are following the footsteps of their disgraced and indicted leader. Mr. Trump tried to chop 16%, $1 billion, from the Army Corps' budget. Those are the facts. So the budget would gut the Department of Homeland Security. It could devastate our economic future and trade enforcement. So it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to put the money where your mouth is and do it if it's meaningful. Rolling back funding would slash customs frontline enforcement by 2,400 agents. Sounds like the IRS 10 years ago. These cuts would cripple our forced labor enforcement. Talk is cheap. I don't have to tell you, Mr. Atkins. So it's going to undo our work if we pass this budget. I'm a longtime champion of strong trade enforcement, but it is not free. I've long pushed for more funding for Customs Trade Office. Cuts of the magnitude my colleagues have proposed are devastating and reckless. Let's be very honest about these cuts, especially since we see the importance of federal investments right here today in Staten Island, USA. Thank you all for being here. Testimony was excellent. I'm going back to Washington in a few minutes to fight the fight. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Fischbach is recognized.
There we go. I had to figure out the technology. But first of all, I want to thank you all for being here because I think the field hearings are one of my favorite things because we get to hear from folks across the country. Georgia and Oklahoma and West Virginia, and so I appreciate it that we get out of D.C. for a variety of reasons, but one of them in particular is being able to talk to folks that what we do in D.C. actually affects. And Mr. Heminger, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm from Minnesota, heavy ag district. I have about 100 miles of Canadian border on the northern part of my district. And, I know that Mr. Smith had mentioned USMCA, very concerned about the, the dairy enforcement. Now we've got the issue with the GMO corn from from Mexico. So very concerned that we actually do the enforcement that we're supposed to on that. And then Mr. Stubbe had mentioned about the competition. I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about the workforce issues. You mentioned it, I think, briefly in your opening statements. You mentioned the H-2A. I think you mentioned E-Verify. In responding to one of the questions. Workforce is a huge issue, and particularly for the ag industry. And so I'm wondering if you could if you have any ideas, what can we do? Is there an answer through visas, immigration policy? What can we do that would make sense to open up that workforce shortage?
Thank you. An excellent question. First of all, we need a comprehensive immigration program that we have kicked down the road for over 15 years. And with that, we have to have a system that at least gives a green card to these people that are here and been working hard. We had a reasonable bill in front of the Congress here 6 months ago or so, and it failed again. That's where we need to start. The H-2A program, I've participated in it for 15 years, unbelievably bureaucratic. We got it a little bit simplified and some things coming along to make it a little more workable. And then in the last 2 years, it's gone just the opposite way. Their formula to figure out the wages is absolutely bizarre. We are priced now so that when I pay overtime on the $16.95 an hour in my greenhouses and cabbage operation, I am double my competitors in Canada's salary. Double. They don't have to pay overtime, and their foreign visa program is more in the $11 to $12 program. And keep in mind, on top of that, we pay, we have brand new housing for the people when they're here. We supply them with all their transportation, including to and from the store. And then part of the program is we pay all their transportation to and from Mexico. In Mexico, they make it an hour here as a day's wage there. And these people are wonderful. I have a few guys, I was only getting a handful 15 years ago. I have a number of them that are still with me. I have more than half my crew that have been with me around 10 years. And they are family to us now. and they come and our farm runs well. We need to embrace that program. It needs to be allowed to be more than just seasonal. Right now it's seasonal only. The dairies need an opportunity to be a part of that program, to bring people here for multiple years. The training and technology on our farms today takes people that need to be trained, and it can take 6 months to train them. We are literally crippling our industry and making our industry have to seek these undocumented workers. It's just so frustrating. And enforce the trade agreements, and it's you know, I have a very, very soft heart for the people that are being misused in other parts of the country. I'm glad that we heard that testimony today. And I believe with trade we could help fix that as well. We need to support the American farmer, or we're only going to be growing corn and soybeans and wheat here. And nothing against my friend from Kansas, but if we want crops that take labor, we have to fix this. Otherwise, we're going to slowly just watch labor-dependent agriculture dwindle here in the United States. And it'd be foolish for us to continue to spend money on these enterprises if we're going to be exiting them.
Well, and thank you very much, and I appreciate that. It was very well said, and we'll continue to pursue what we can to make sure we get that workforce shortage dealt with. And I just want to say, I apologize. I have to leave early. I've got to get back to D.C. for another committee hearing. But thank you again all for being here. And with that, I yield back 2 seconds.
Thank you. Mr. Estes is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all our witnesses today for being here. I appreciate having field hearings outside of the D.C. Beltway to hear firsthand really how our policies that are made in Washington affect families and businesses. And I think today's really useful as we talk about trade here, particularly in a hub of global commerce. There's strong bipartisan support for some of the trade themes we've talked about today, expanding markets for our manufacturers and producers, continuing the good work we started with USMCA, enforcing our existing agreements, and holding China accountable. I briefly want to touch on a nonpartisan common sense bill that I believe will help us in the competitive on a global stage and enhance our ability here at home to innovate and expand trade opportunities. The bill restores immediate R&D expensing for American innovators and entrepreneurs, the American Innovation and R&D Competitiveness Act. I was joined with my Ways and Means colleague on the other side of the aisle, Congressman John Larson, and many others on this committee. According to the R&D Coalition, the U.S. share of global R&D investments in 2019 was 30%, which is down from 33% in 2009 and 40% in 1999. On the other hand, China, their global shares of R&D expense has gone up. It was 24% in 2019, a big jump from 5% in 2000 and 15% in 2009. That means that China's R&D expenses have grown by 400% in just 2 decades. By disincentivizing R&D here at home, American tax policies encourages manufacturers and production to move abroad. And we know where R&D occurs is critical for job manufacturing, job growth, and having jobs, period, that then allow us to export American-made products. Mr. Romano, the National Taxpayers Union called this bill a no-brainer and thinks that given its broad bipartisan support and real-world application, it should pass with ease. Do you agree with this as a no-brainer, and what would you say to my colleagues to help encourage them to support legislation like this?
I would absolutely say that it agrees. That I would agree with that. From the standpoint of research and development, you think about what we do. We're a miner, and we upgrade the products that ultimately we sell as finished goods to, people like you. Our product is a quality of life product, and the only way we're going to stay ahead of the Chinese is through investment in technology. Technology for the products that we make, the way we make them, and obviously reinvesting in technology and supporting growth with our own employees so that they have the technology and the skills that are required to, as we upgrade our facilities, they've got the capability to run those facilities with new techniques.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I talked a little bit about China and their R&D investments. We also know that China's been involved in predatory trade practices and participates in atrocious human rights abuses. At the same time, they've used their Belt and Road Initiative to deepen ties with other countries, while the United States has taken a back seat to some of these practices, including expanding trade. This is deeply disturbing and has a detrimental impact to U.S. workers and small businesses. From a human rights and economic standpoint, Mr. Turkle, what's your assessment of China's aggressive approach to trade, and what should the U.S. be doing to counter the Chinese Communist Party and these practices?
Thank you very much for the question. The BRI that you mentioned also has something to do with the ongoing genocide and enslavement of the Uyghur people. When you look at at least in the last 10 years of Chinese economic growth, it has been slowed because they claim that they got millions of people out of poverty, but at the same time it created a vacuum, a labor shortage, which still is the case. And they try to resolve that issue by using the Uyghurs as a modern-day slave. That's one. And the other is a political reason, as I alluded earlier. It's about total control. So one of the things that we have to do in order to address this is to look at the ways in which that we can not only fully enforce the existing laws, but also looking at new laws. One of the new laws that I think that would be very helpful is the modeling the FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, to make human rights abuses, enslavement of Uyghurs, atrocity crimes, a law enforcement matter, attaching it to the existing law that we're discussing today. The other thing is that we need to implement Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act that specifically mandates the administration to continue to sanction Chinese entities. And the UFLPA also requires entity list designation. Since last June, there are only 20 companies that have been designated. We need to expand that. There are 55,000 entities doing business in the Uyghur region. We don't have to designate all of them entity list, but the vast majority of them, including this one here that I'm showing, this amazing report produced by my colleagues at the Uyghur Human Rights Project, reporting the dates, red dates, coming to the United States that are produced, exported by Xinjiang Production Construction Corp., which recognized by the United States government as a paramilitary and also sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act. I'd like to ask Chairman for your permission to include this in the record.
Without objection.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And there's so many issues to talk about. I'd love to talk about some agriculture issues from Kansas with New York, but unfortunately I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentle lady from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Neal. And I want to thank all of you who are here today. What a gorgeous day. I, along with my chairman, probably wish that I was wearing the Panama hat that I received in Ecuador when we were down on a trade trip with many of our neighbors and allies talking trade. I want to thank each one of you personally, Mr. Atkins, Mr. Heminger. I'm a fellow Farm Bureau member, Mr. Turkle, all of you, Mr. Romano, Mr. O'Shea, which we would say O'Shea in West Virginia, so I'm sure you get that a lot. I am from a beautiful state full of incredible natural resources, and in particular water and these rivers that all flow down to the Ohio River. And Huntington, where I live, is either the first or second largest inland waterway port. It depends on what Cincinnati has to say about that. But we move different things than you move right here in these ports. Mr. Romano, I understand that your company is considering building a rare earth plant in Mississippi, and my home state of West Virginia, of course, has received similar interest in developing these capabilities and bringing an essential part of the supply chain to the United States. I'm greatly concerned about China's dominance. We keep hearing this through this entire discussion today, and their dominance in the critical mineral market, because the United States absolutely has the capabilities to promote our own domestic industry, and for too long the federal government has gotten in the way. So we are working to be able to change that. Can you discuss what challenges your company has faced when deciding whether to develop a critical mineral processing plant right here in the United States? And do you have any suggestions for Congress to ensure that the U.S. processing plant can be competitive in the current market?
Thank you for your question. So as I mentioned in my testimony, or maybe I didn't in a question, we have so monazite is a product that we mine at the same time that we mine titanium in South Africa and Australia. So historically what we've done with that, it was a waste stream and that was being processed and sold to China. So over the course of the last several years, we've turned that into a revenue stream. But now we're looking at how we can step down the value chain and actually build a facility in Hamilton and upgrade that product similar to the way we upgrade titanium dioxide. So, you know, there is a lot of money when you think involved in that. It's a capital expense. So I use a different raw material, cobalt. You think about, there's a company not long ago that just tried to build a mine there without any trade barriers. The mine came up and running, and what did China do? They dropped the price for cobalt. So they have the same capability to do that in rare earth applications, and that's why China owns dominantly over 90% of that. So I think we're uniquely positioned as a miner and also an upgrader of raw materials to look at Hamilton as a facility. We believe that's a great location for us to expand our footprint, support the local employment of that area, and also be able to develop products that will be used here in America and possibly even by the U.S. government. Monazite is the product that we would be selling into that for rare earth oxides, and it's used in military applications for F-15s. You think about every electronic device inside one of those F-15s has a motor in it. Those motors have rare earths in them, so it's also wind turbines, electric vehicles. So we're looking to see how we can partner with companies in the U.S. to make sure that we have not only a viable plan, but one that is economical for us long term.
One of the things I've thought in office is that I wish I had a degree in chemistry, particularly because of the natural resources. And I think about all the byproducts left over from coal throughout the years. But I'll switch direction with you a little bit to talk about how President Trump's Section 301 tariffs against China could have helped your company remain as a viable competitor. I believe it's essential that we deliberate with our tariffs in a strategic as well as providing potential relief for non-strategic goods that are important to U.S. businesses. Can you talk about conditions for U.S. titanium dioxide producers before tariffs were imposed?
Yeah, so again, I've been with this company for many years, and I've seen many plants close over time. So we had production in Savannah, Georgia, where we made a titanium product that was specific to the paper industry. And I can remember having meetings with customers at that time telling them that we didn't choose to be competitive because the Chinese were bringing that material in at half our costs. Ultimately, that plant ended up closing. So when we think about, okay, now fast forward to 2017 when the tariffs were put in place, there has been no plant closures. Capacity is idled a bit, slowed down a bit just due to supply and demand, but capacity as nameplate has not changed. You think about the imports of TiO2 into the U.S. versus, or out of the consumption of TiO2 in the U.S. versus production. We consume as a country about 1 million tons a year of titanium dioxide, and we have a capacity utilization of 1.5 million. So there's really no need to have that much material coming in, and those tariffs have been extremely helpful for us.
That's great. Mr. Atkins, thank you for hosting us here today. I've traveled extensively since becoming a member of Congress, and I was thrilled to go to the port of Singapore last year. As the operator of the second largest port in America, I would be very interested in hearing how you think U.S. ports compare to others globally and what role Congress plays in maintaining your competitiveness.
Yes, thank you for the question. The U.S. side, it's a good blend of the equipment that we utilize and how we work with the workforce. Over in Singapore and a lot of the other ports around the world, they tend to be transshipment hubs, highly mechanized, highly automated. Automation doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be faster. It just means it's consistent. We have an operation over in Bayonne that does have a degree of remote operation. We kept people in particular jobs, in equipment that actually performs faster than some of these automated operations. So there needs to be continued investment across the board, as we talked about on dredging, on the equipment that we have. And, you know, we I know there's a Buy America piece when it comes to these large gantry cranes that we talk about. There's just no manufacturers when it comes to any of these large cranes that you see. And these cranes on average are $15 to $18 million a piece. So it's heavy, heavy investment that's not responsible for any type of federal grants or subsidies. So those are the type things that we could look to stay competitive with other ports around the world. But it's a good blend of the investment that you have on your infrastructure and the labor that you have on your facility.
And you answered my next question very well. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Kustoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nice hat. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Thank you, Mr. Atkins, for hosting us. If I go to you, and you talked about this in your testimony and in response to the questions, but maybe if I can go a little bit deeper. The volume here today is less and maybe substantially less than it was a year ago. Is that a fair statement? And can you give, I think you gave these numbers, but can you give the numbers of today versus a year ago and maybe at the start of the pandemic?
So our numbers today, year over year, going back exactly 12 months, were approximately 42% down now as from where we were last year.
Give that number again, I'm sorry.
42%. If you took our numbers that we have today and go back to 2019, as you know, we classify as pre-pandemic, we're down about 15% year over year.
And how would you characterize the supply chain issues today as compared to a year ago?
I think I had, as I phrased it earlier, the time kind of dissipated the supply chain issues. Right. What we were experiencing last year was a large glut of cargo that all was getting pushed out at once, where everything, there was no place to put it. Now that trade has slowed down and, you know, the inventory levels that we saw during the pandemic have come down, that has greatly eased, if not eliminated, the supply chain issues that we saw a year ago.
To be fair about it, it's more of a demand issue than it is a supply chain issue.
Correct.
You've been in this business 30 years. You've seen up and down cycles. How would you characterize this cycle where we are now, or are we in a cycle?
This is a very cyclical business. When, you know, interest rates are up, consumer purchasing goes down. When in 2008 and 9, during the financial crisis, trade came pretty much to a grinding halt. So we appear to be in a self-correction period, I think you could call it, where we are, you know, the shippers and cargo owners that you see across the board are working down their inventory levels. Once they get to a certain point, you'll start to see a replenishment, and you should see volumes then coming back.
Where we are today, not a true definition, but would you characterize this as is it softening? Are we in a recession now?
Oh, math and economics was never my strong suit in college, but from where we sit, you still see, you know, buying going on. We do employ outside economists that help us try to read the tea leaves, and you still see purchasing going on. It's just working the inventory levels down. Yeah. So I wouldn't call it necessarily a recession.
When you forecast out, say, 90 days, how does this seaport look then compared to now?
From the larger shippers that we talk to and cargo owners, they are saying third quarter you should start to see a bounce back. But historically, you start in June, inventory or volumes start to pick up, getting ready for back-to-school goods, starting to replenish warehouses for Christmas shopping, so forth and so on. So combination of the usual annual cycle that you see on top of inventories starting to need to be replenished should be around third quarter.
I think one example you gave was furniture and
yes.
lack of demand, and I think you characterized it because of rising interest rates. So you expand that out, if interest rates stay elevated compared to where they were, the demand for furniture may not be what it was a couple of years ago. Would that be a fair statement?
That is a very fair statement.
If I can, in just my remaining time, in your opening statement and in your written statement, you talked about the media reporting in 2002 on the supply chain, blaming it on carriers, and that was misplaced.
Yes.
What were the reasons?
Well, the reasons were an oversupply of the material that was coming in, that there was no place left to go. I mean, an ocean carrier does not make money with their vessel while it's sitting anchored for 2 weeks waiting to get into harbor. So they have a vested interest to get in, get the ship discharged and out. But marine terminals, whether it's East Coast or West Coast, both coasts, there was just no room left on the marine terminals to discharge vessels.
Thank you, Mr. X. Mr. Turkle, just briefly, since I'm out of time, we all know about, following up on the supply chain, what COVID demonstrated to all of us is we need certain manufacturing, like to have all manufacturing, but PPE and pharmaceuticals especially closer to home. And to your point, I think you outlined it really well about the forced labor. My question to you is, government can do what government can do. Doesn't private industry itself, though, have some responsibility as it relates to the forced labor?
Absolutely. The private sector has been doing two things. One, during the process of passing this bill, they opposed to it, as you may recall. And then after the bill, this legislation become a law, they're trying to slow down the process of implementation. And then the third thing that they're doing is not publicly talking about the things that they have done. When you ask them, why can you just go out and tell them that you terminated your relationship with a questionable supplier, they said, oh, there will be retaliation. There is a company called O-Film that makes the iPhone screens. Apple let them go, but to this day, Apple never talks about publicly why they let this company go. So this is the private sector has a huge responsibility, and now they should have find out that this country that they have been telling American people is an ideal place for doing business is becoming increasingly hostile.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Ms. Tenney of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the chairman for bringing us here, and thank you, Ranking Member Neal, and also thank you to my colleague, Nicole Maliotakis, for hosting us here. Nicole was part of our special Farm Bureau event when we were in the New York State Legislature, Adopt a New York City Legislator, where we brought her to upstate New York to visit a farm, to see what it's like to grow up on the farm. And so that's why I'm just so excited and glad to be in Staten Island for my first time. Sad to say I haven't been here sooner. What a beautiful spot, and thank you to Mr. Atkins also. And I just want to say especially thank you to Mr. Heminger for your great testimony today. You're a very popular person on the panel today, and we appreciate your leadership in New York as a agricultural leader, as someone who started with just a small dairy farm and turned it into a large enterprise with real automation. We watched your cows. I got to visit the farm and watch them waiting in line to get into the self-milking machine. That was pretty incredible to see. And then to expand into the crops that you do. We're grateful that your family's still part of this business. I think that's so important to highlight your family is part of all of this, and they're still involved. You're devoted to New York State. You face the obstacles, and you're continuing to go forward. Not everyone in agriculture has been able to do that. But yet New York State is one of the most important agricultural leaders, and in fact, New York 24, which I represent, is the #1 agricultural district in the Northeast and the #1 dairy producer in the Northeast. People find that incredible to believe, but I know Ms. Maliotakis knows all about that because she's now been to upstate New York and toured around and just to see how beautiful it is and how wonderful our soil is, something you talked about, the importance of soil, water, the great resources we have, and yet we have a government that makes it difficult sometimes for us to operate. So at your business, though, I saw a lot of great workers who were grateful to you, grateful to your leadership, a lot of very happy cows. They enjoyed a good atmosphere, good weather conditions, good nutrition, and that's the secret to producing. I also wanted to just say your leadership in not just your family, but everyone. And I wanted to just say you have this expression, which I actually wrote. I took a picture of it when I was at your firm, and I could see it in your employees, your family, your happy cows. And Hemdale Farms has this thing called Cowtails. And the C stands for can-do attitude, the O for ownership, and everyone has an ownership in the business, including your great employees that are foreign workers in some cases. Winners having fun, and everybody was obviously having fun, especially the cows. Teamwork, accepting change, which you've been through in order to survive in New York. It's a tough place to be. Integrity, which is really important, and a lot of people don't understand how important our agricultural businesses are. Land and environmental stewardship, something that our farmers are doing every day in preserving our communities and our land, our great land. And you mentioned something about that and I want to ask you about the solar panels. Instead of growing apples, we're growing solar panels as a specialty crop, and I say that as a joke. And service to community and family. And I just want to say this is a great motto that you keep, and that's why I think a secret to your success. Pretty much everyone's asked you about all the different issues, whether it's dealing with the USMCA, the unfair trade with Canada, your 30-year struggle to get your products into Canada and around the world. And then you also talked a lot about labor and our farm worker labor bill that we've tried to get through in many ways, and having people understand that, the challenges with E-Verify. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about what I mentioned just now, is the specialty crop known as solar panels, and a little bit about what's going on with energy in New York State. So the Democrats, who control everything in New York State on the government level, in terms of the state, just passed a $229 billion tax and spend package, the largest budget in New York State history, even beyond what we thought after the American Rescue Funds of $12 billion were inserted into it. This makes the budget the first ever to ban hookups to natural gas coming down the road. How is energy impacted in your district, your operation, as a multi-faceted agricultural industry, and what's the future with this, and is this sustainable in considering the cost of, whether we're talking about the cost of fertilizer, maintaining your dairy operation, maintaining all of your operations to get them to market?
Well, thank you for the compliments, Congresswoman Tenney. We are very concerned about this energy piece. To me, it is way too much, too fast. You'd be interested to know my greenhouse operation had the land all ready to expand to a couple more greenhouses, waiting for the farm labor bill to get resolved. And because of that and where we are today, we have not built them greenhouses. We're turning business away. Those greenhouses are heated by propane. No one's figured out how to heat a greenhouse efficiently with electric yet. And we dry the corn that we have to feed the cows in the winter for grain. That portion of their diet we dry with propane. And of course, the robotic milkers run with electric, and then the tractors run with fuel, and trucks with diesel and whatnot. I'm very concerned. I'm actually confused. I don't believe that this is going to work. And I'll just say again, as I said earlier, we are looking more and more at just becoming a grain-only farm and having a fraction of the employees we have, and buying a big combine. Right now, the little bit of grain combine, I have a neighbor with a great combine who's a great operator run it, and just changing our focus and having a lot less employees and a lot less balls in the air, because we don't believe we're going to be able to survive. My friends in the fruit business, apple harvest in particular, is their #1 cost. Labor is over half their expense in an apple farm, and they're seriously going to bulldoze their trees out and put in solar panels. In Western New York, near Batavia, there's a 400 or 500 acre area of beautiful vegetable ground, farmland that's being developed into solar right now. I'm all pro solar, but I believe my children and my grandchildren's generations will say, what were they thinking letting some of the best farmland in the world have all these solar panels on it? I'm all pro solar.
Thank you, Mr. Heminger.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
I'd like to recognize Mr. Moore of Utah for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Great job hosting. Wonderful venue. Thanks for setting this all up for us today. Mr. Romano, your line of questioning with my colleague from West Virginia actually hit on a lot of the things I wanted to talk about. So instead, I'm going to pivot and actually ask you and Mr. Turkle to just reiterate for the group today just the salient point in both of your areas. Mr. Romano, you're talking a lot about competitiveness with China and some of the unfair practices that they're doing with respect to international trade. Mr. Turkle, we're talking forced labor camps in Xinjiang province with the Uyghur population, something I'm proud that the U.S. is working on. We're not there yet, but we're taking action on this. Just make it, just clearly communicate to us one more time, what do we and the rest of the world, or those, partners of ours across international coalitions, need to continue to do or do more of to combat both of your areas of influence and of expertise?
So, as I mentioned, I gave a couple of statistics around what's happening in other areas of the world where things like Section 301 are not being utilized. It's very public what some of the Chinese companies are doing. Actually, I've got a document here that shows what the largest company did. I made reference to it in my presentation, where they're publicly saying, they're at 50%, they're adding more capacity, and their goal is to see the removal of Western suppliers. So it's not just in the U.S. We operate on 6 different continents. The U.S., we have our largest TiO2 facility, but we also operate on every continent. We sell into 120 different countries. We have a plant in Brazil where exports into Brazil have gone from 60,000 tons to 90,000 tons. The way they are continuing to penetrate using stolen technology in many instances and then expanding that. There's a book called The Tiger Trap, which is a great read, and it talks about how over time, decades, the Chinese accumulate technology and then eventually start to put that in place, and that's what you're seeing now. We've had experience with plant closures in Georgia, as I've mentioned. We closed a plant in Antwerp. There are at least 2 companies today in Spain and Germany that are looking at closing down. So it's not just the U.S. The U.S. has done a great job of managing that and, again, protecting U.S. business and particularly our businesses. But it's continuing to reinforce what's been happening and continuing to reevaluate, are those tariffs high enough? Today, the Chinese, you can use an average price of our product today is around $3,000 a ton. In many instances, we're being undercut by more than $1,000 a ton, and we know these companies are not making money.
Thank you. Mr. Turkle.
Thank you. For starters, we have to acknowledge, recognize our own problem, which is our complicity in the ongoing atrocity crimes. American consumers need to know that more than 80 global brands that we consume on a daily basis, agricultural products, cleaning supplies, solar panels, EV batteries, literally everything is made with slave labor. I just mentioned 55,000 entities doing business in the Uyghur homeland, Uyghur region. That explains. And then 2, we need to close the loophole. The de minimis is one of the areas that we need to target. I commend the 24 members of Congress recently wrote asking SEC to demand the Shane Company to go through mandatory independent auditing. That is one way to look at it. And then also naming shaming. It's so important when you deal with the issues at this magnitude. We should not let any perpetrators, any bad actors to stay anonymous. We have about 50,000 companies that have been responsible for internal labor transfer. We should go after them if 55,000 is too much to deal with. And also, finally, we need to stop investing in our own self-destruction. The American people are still investing in Chinese high-tech. There are 64 companies that have been sanctioned because of the human rights abuses. Only 11 of them are not listed or identified as the companies that the American people should not make an investment.
Thank you so much. Well, Mr. Heminger, a few seconds left. Just to thank you for your work with respect to USMCA. My northern part of Utah, where my district is, strong dairy producers. And so the work you're doing to create competitiveness and making sure we're all playing by the same rules is very important. So, and thank you for your comments as well on immigration and comprehensive immigration reform. We have to think about every step of this, and it's great to hear your perspective. So thank you, and I I yield the time I don't have back.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Ms. Steele from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you all the witnesses coming for this important hearing and raising awareness about the issues at our port. Even though Los Angeles and Long Beach airports are the biggest ports in the United States, companies are leaving Long Beach and LA. Ports in California had been in chaos and now have turned into ghost towns. West Coast ports have major backlog caused in part by ships idling off the coast of Southern California. It makes matters worse. California regulations like AB 5 and new environmental regulations cause independent truckers to leave California and they cannot come back in. There has been also been years for long headache around the longshoreman's contract, which is still being negotiated. It's almost a year now. In 2023, the output at Long Beach and LA ports are down 30%. You said here 42%, but 30% compared to the first quarter of last year. The FY23 NDAA included My Supply Chain Task Force Act to ensure the government works with our ports to improve effectiveness. So, Mr. Atkin, our ports need to allow automation. You were just talked about just a little bit about it, and modernization to compete with our major port. We need to ensure that our ports are always modernizing so that we can expand trade and move goods. Do you think we can enhance ports with new technologies and automation that will help protect our workers and allow us to compete with other ports around the world?
Now, that's a fantastic question, and it's one that's equal on the East Coast and West Coast. I don't think we should confuse automation with modernization. Modernization of ports means bigger cranes to service the larger ships. When we talked about dredging in New York in 1997, the industry thought 5,600 TEUs, 20-foot equivalents, was going to be the biggest ship this harbor would ever see. We are now handling 16,000 TEU-sized vessels, and they're scrapping vessels smaller than 8,000 TEUs. So modernization really is keeping up with the size of the vessels, looking at sustainability with hybrid equipment, all electric equipment, and also using data to be able to streamline and pass off cargo from one part of the supply chain to the other. So there needs to be a consistent investment in the harbors and the ports to be able to handle the larger ships. And larger ships are beneficial to the U.S. consumer because the economy of scales of a container load of shoes coming on a 16,000 TEU vessel means it's much cheaper transportation costs than on the smaller vessel. So it's incumbent upon government and private industry to keep investing in the infrastructure and modernizing these facilities, and everyone benefits from that.
Thank you for that answer. I have a question to Mr. Romano. That I just read the Korean newspaper. I speak Korean as my first and Japanese my second, so I read all these newspapers. And CCP actually, Korea doesn't have that kind of like a battery building materials. So what happened was yesterday, they just announced that they're gonna invest over $1 trillion to Korea, and they're building these batteries, and then they want to sell it that it was made in Korea and coming into the United States. How are we going to stop this kind of loopholes?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. Korea is a big market for us. It's probably the third largest market we sell into behind India. I made reference to that even in Africa with regards to the minerals that are being mined in that area by Chinese producers who historically don't own assets there. I was not aware of the article you just referenced in Korea. But it's one of the biggest struggles that we have. And I think the best thing we can do in the U.S. is support development of that technology in the U.S., and other countries like Korea should do the same. Korea is a huge trading partner with China. A lot of our business in Korea over the course of through the pandemic has been significantly impacted because China slowed down their production, therefore Korea slowed down theirs. So I think what we're talking about here in the U.S., trying to reinforce how we can make in the U.S. and sell in the U.S., other countries need to do the same thing.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Van Dyne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. China has been aggressively signing trade and economic agreements across the Indo-Pacific, Latin America, and in Africa, as we all know. The result is that these countries and these regions are growing more dependent on Chinese technology companies and supply chains, opening the door for China's authoritarian digital practices to take root in putting U.S. technology companies at a significant competitive disadvantage. And this all serves China's broader strategic interests. Furthermore, China's lack of transparency and disregard for human rights has led to a growing concern among many nations. I recently traveled to Cambodia and Singapore to discuss trade issues, and the resounding message that we heard was the Biden administration continues to leave a void that China is more than eager to fill. And as a nation, we must reclaim our leadership on the global stage and hold China accountable when it comes to its trade and global influence. Trade enforcement must be targeted to cut off unfair trade while facilitating swift movement of fairly traded products. Small businesses facing historically high inflation and a protracted supply chain crisis cannot afford all of this unnecessary red tape. The United States must hold China accountable for its human rights abuses and predatory trade practices that devastate American jobs. And I'm glad to join my colleagues on this committee and work to improve our supply chain and advance a trade agenda that protects American workers. Mr. Turkle, you had mentioned in one of your answers just recently, you were talking about how the U.S. needs to stop fighting against itself. Can you expand on that?
You mean can you repeat that question again?
You had mentioned earlier in one of your last answers that the U.S. needs to stop fighting itself.
Yeah, I mentioned that for two reasons. One, the American consumers continue to purchase those tainted products that have been shipped out of China to the global supply chain. And then two, American investors, pension funds, are fueling this genocide and contributing to the Chinese political economy. And finally, the Chinese tech, it's going both ways actually, has been so effective, and the Chinese developed, tested, utilized, and now exporting all around the world. And some of our Silicon Valley companies that are silent on this issue has been helping the Chinese high tech. That's what I meant when I said we need to stop.
I'd also argue that the U.S. government is doing the same thing. Last year, I had introduced an amendment when I was on the Transportation Committee, and the amendment would prevent the U.S. from importing materials that were mined with forced labor or child labor. I couldn't get a single Democrat to support that amendment. Do you believe that that's happening today? Are we importing minerals that have been mined by child or forced labor?
It's highly likely. I'm not a solar panel expert, but I've consulted with people who knows the industry. For example, the type of dirty work using coal to make solar panel, specifically Uyghur youth being subject to, is something that the Chinese population, the majority Han population, will not be involved in and engaging in. So based on that, and also the internal migration that has been in practice for years, even while I was living in China in the 1990s, points to the direction that the Uyghur youth have also been subject to forced labor practices.
Thank you very much for that answer. Mr. Romano, your company is using its supply chain and it's trying to create a rare earth mineral plant in Mississippi. Recently, the Biden administration signed critical mineral agreements with Japan and are currently negotiating with the EU. These agreements lack safeguards on where they source their critical minerals and make us, again, more reliant on China. Can you tell me a little bit about what Tronox is doing to build up the rare earth domestic industry, and what policies can the U.S. purpose to ensure that critical minerals are produced here at home?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So as I mentioned earlier, We have for many years been mining rare earth materials in the form of monazite and been processing that up until recently and been selling it to China. So that's where the market is. We talk about how does China get to the point where it is today? It's because they control the market. They have more than 90% of the production capacity. So what we're looking at doing now is building a facility in Hamilton, Mississippi, where we would take the products that we would have historically shipped to China and bring them into the U.S. and upgrade those into products that can be used in the magnets that I referred to earlier. I think there's got to be some sort of, 301 is another good example of how we've managed our core business, which is TiO2, but making sure that China can't do what they've historically done, and that is drop the price very quickly where it makes it uneconomical for people like us to look at investigating, expanding what would be a natural transition from us from mining those products and selling them to mining them and upgrading them and selling them into the U.S. We're looking at getting some funding from the U.S., so we're making good progress in that area. But I think USTR 301 trade tariffs have had a huge impact on our business. Those kinds of things will help us make sure China doesn't do that to us in this particular space around minerals, around rare earths.
Excellent. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Feenstra is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and thank you, Congresswoman Meliotakis, for allowing us to be in your district. It's pretty awesome. Iowa is one of the largest agricultural producers in the world, and my district is at the heart of that. We rank #1 in virtually all egg categories, including pork, eggs, grain, soy, livestock, and so forth. Actually, 1 out of every 5 jobs in Iowa depends on trade and foreign markets. Here's the problem. More than 2/3 of all ag exports are traded with 6 partners: China, Mexico, Canada, Japan, EU, and South Korea. They all have the same thing in common. They allow, for the most part, free trade agreements. And China obviously makes up dangerously the largest proportion of all these countries combined. It's clear that we need to establish more free trade agreements. Opening new export markets will help American businesses and farmers at the same time to reduce the intense dependency on China. So, Mr. Heminger, my question is this. Having more customers buying your products with new export markets is essential. How important is the diversification of export markets to your business?
Well, it's very important, and like I said, we wish we could send back to Canada the things that we are producing, because they're a big competitor of mine with the greenhouse business and the vegetable business. So the diversified opportunities is very important. We have consciously made a decision not to be just a grain farmer. That's just how we're put together. We always grew a bunch of vegetables for Bird's Eye, and now we've transitioned to what we're doing now. So to answer your question, I believe that we as a country, and also to keep ourselves diversified crops in many, many different markets is critical.
Yeah, and I wholly agree with you. I mean, you think about what's happening right now when we have such a narrow market group of 6, a few more here and there. It's really worrisome, especially in our commodity markets right now, of how that changes price when you have one company saying, hey, I'm going to buy X and not buy. You talked about Canada. You even think about China, phase 1, phase 2 trade deals and stuff like that. Phase 1 went through, phase 2 very little. Can you just talk a little bit more about that, of when you see trade markets failing or that just never happens, for instance, like China, how does that affect your business?
Well, it's real simple. It's real simple. Without markets, we don't survive.
Yes.
Okay? And that's what happened with Bird's Eye. I started to see my neighbors and competitors and actually some cousins leave the business. And thought, well, I'll be one of the survivors. Well, in the end, it didn't matter. They sold every plant, and they're buying stuff overseas.
100%.
But back to your comments about China, I just read this week, 1 in 6 bushel of soybeans produced in the world is used by China. You talk about a centralized market, and soybeans have become critical to the future, to American ag. Certainly, you know more about this than I could ever imagine.
Well, no, and you hit it on the head. 71% of our soybeans go to China. right? That's a killer. So if they don't buy it, obviously we're going to get crushed. And I thank you for your comments on that. I mean, this is so critical to the American farmer. I just don't hear it from the administration how important agriculture is and how important our exports are. And we have Kathleen Tai that's just sitting on her hands, not doing anything for the ag community. One other barrier to new export markets is the lack of cold chain storage in many of our developing markets. The lack of cold chain is one of the major barriers in expanding and diversifying markets in new countries. Each year we lose billions and billions of perishable food products due to poor cold chain system conditions. Mr. Heminger, could you talk about this? Obviously, you have dairy. I have a lot of dairy in my district. I also have a lot of livestock that's perishable, needs to be refrigerated. How does this affect you also when the cold chain storage is very weak in a lot of developing countries, and how we can expand on that?
Well, it's just common sense. We have to have a cold chain to maintain all the way to the consumer at the other end, and without that, food spoils. So your point is well taken and very important.
Yeah, thanks. Again, we talk about expanding markets. We need free trade, but we also need developing countries to look at how we can handle cold storage. I mean, that, again, helps dairy, helps livestock, helps all our producers. Again, this is all tied in. Then finally, I think I got, if I can see the clock, I got a little bit of time left. Mr. Heminger, you said this in your testimony. GMOs are the most important scientific breakthrough in history for the future of feeding a hungry world of 8 billion people. We know GMOs are so essential, and yet there's a lot of countries like Mexico and others that are sort of stepping back and concerned about this. What would you say to those countries?
There is no scientific base to stand on that say that GMOs have any concern at all. You can actually find natural GMOs in our foods that have evolved on their own. And there's not a question in my mind that as we continue to go from 8 billion people that we hit last fall in the world, and they're talking about it being at 9 billion people here in a bit, that we need science-based technology to feed this world. And I just hope we have an infrastructure to get the food around the world to the people that need it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I want to thank each one of you for each of your testimonies. It is so critical that we expand our export market and do things, even in the Ag Committee, when we have the next Farm Bill coming up with MAP and other areas that we can grow to expand our export markets. And it's got to be the #1 thing for me in agriculture to get done here in the next Farm Bill and through Ways and Means. It is so essential for this country. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank every member of our committee. I want to thank the ranking member, Neil, for being here, Republicans and Democrats, part of a historical hearing where it's, like I said, they say it's the first outside full committee hearing in 100 years, and it's right here in Staten Island. I also want to thank the Global Containers Terminals here in New York for hosting it, and also the Port and Police and Guards Union and the International Longshoremen's Association for all of your support. And, of course, Ms. Representative Malliotakis for hosting it. We appreciate your hospitality. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. I want to thank each and every one of you again as well for taking time out of your busy schedule and for being here and sharing some good information. With that, the committee stands adjourned.